Lamodong Ingum Gunjambe Yung La Sha Za Lo Gongge Lo Zhe Dem Nye Den Nye Tra Nam Da Rab Sra Ve Chi Nye Dong Gun Je Yen Se Nye Je Tu Gra Le Gong Dong Gong Da Se Be Zun Re Ma Re Men Tam Dung E Che Se Ve Ro Zoi Gun Lai Po Je Dar Ze Yin Lai Chu Ju Yung Den Song Rudare Chedro Nyamo Nyeno Leje Chadro Ronze Jen Mariam Sra Dungara Nyugo Chinye Jenze Raje Nam Tene Taj Saju Tarsu Yunden Luzo Yase Tuyu Ko Chudra Chodan Chunyi Jente Dalu Meze Jambe Yung La Du Zedin Che Che Chenra Vezre Che Dalu De Muhammad Barafrane Kadan Tenje Jong Lu Do Pa Ye Lu Zhe Pa Be Non Wa Zal Do Solo Kange Den Jen De Wan Zhang Gagwan Me Pa Jen Me Pa Te Pan Me Pa Ta Me Pa Wan Me Pa Zho Me Pa Ta De Den Me Den Ji Me Zhe Pa Nye Ji Shir Den Be Zog Be Sang Ji Na Nam Ji Dang Ba De La Sha Ca Lo En Jam Yang Sha Na Dur Je Jen Re Zi Sa Ye Nin Bo Zhe Pa Nam Pra Sa Re Nam Ge Nin Bo Shang Pa Gun Du Zong Nye We Se Shin Je La Sha Je Wo She Je Ka La Chen Rab Jin Ku Ra Je Zai Be We Dong Dur Je Len La Po Yar We Den Ba Ge Ne San Zai Be Ge Ju Ren Bo Che La Sha Je Wo Tsarab Gun Du Si Je Tan Yi Le Tam Ke Sam Me Sha Ge Yong Zong Shin Shang Jum Nin Be Lam Ken Kar Ma Pa Me She De Be Ji Yue Zu Ge Du Na So Tene Namba So Samba Shung Chup Cho Do Tu Je Param Boche Sal Tam Ne Tambe Chu Sero Nang.
So Khenpo Rinpoche asks everyone to begin with generating the body mind in a clear and precise manner, and with that as one's motivation, one then listens attentively to the explanations that will be given.
Ta Thoma Tri Ma Kam Shue Te Chö Je Dam Chimbu Jig Nang Ne Tong Ba Tong Dang Me Kor Te Ma Shubi Yore.
So today's topic concerns the third of the so-called four seals in Buddhism, each of which one can see as a summary of a number of topics, so that all four, in fact, sum up the entire Buddhist doctrine. And as you probably know by now, the third of the four is the statement by the Buddha, or the topic the Buddha set forth in terms of the third of the four seals, is that of empty and without a self.
Tin de ta khazang mama de chertang tong ba ni se de kortela yin the be gi ye chu thang te ching gi ye chu to ze men da ha ji yong ge ya de yin na yang ni ka khoden nang la tong ba se de ji tong ba tong chong ji la zan song bi sa ma re di kor nga zu ke ja mang ko chi song so den yang chu chwa den de nang de na 동바 동정지를 고대비 쏟아오지 거기도 게 말에
as has been explained previously, there are some slight variations with regard to the word empty, as well as with regard to the short phrase without the self, in terms of Theravada Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism. Now, at the end of the previous session, Khenpo Rinpoche said you're welcome to ask questions, and some of the questions that have been asked indicate that with the word empty, nothingness is understood. Empty in the sense of there being nothing at all.
디인데 단디 꼴때 개심버지 임바송데 드린다 산이니라 대nghe 강타다지 나랑 기세도 되네 마감이 쇼비
Khenpo Rinpoche will during today's lecture and tomorrow as well try to make as clear as possible, according to his own knowledge of what the word empty is about here, give explanations.
테네 네 단드세요. 테네 대간 하신 게 단데 베베게이네 게이 현실은 로고드 pena emptiness 생겼더라 고아간대지 용기 요매 거로 끼끼당아서 가자 개자 망고 총수 대끼끼게 디시너리 때 텐데 제송때 백기메 좀메 지란 고게 아유나 선심제 단다 망보로 고기 유사래 emptiness 생겼다 다지당 뒤코트 깨깨기 단다 말라 그래.
Yeah. So it appears quite common that when people hear the word empty, or emptiness for that matter, used more frequently in Mahayana Buddhism, they draw the conclusion that what this is about is a mere nothingness, that there is nothing at all. Now, in terms of the English language, and I presume in most other languages, whether French, German, Swedish, or whatever, it's a fact that a given word, as in the Tibetan language, can take a number of meanings. Therefore, one shouldn't presume that the meaning that first comes to mind when one hears the word empty is what is meant. One needs to research the word a bit, and in particular the word empty, as it's such a key term used so often in Buddhism, whether Theravada Buddhism or Mahayana Buddhism. According to most dictionaries that give a more brief explanation, there are other dictionaries that go into more detail. So one should also keep in mind that it's good to look up the various meanings of a specific word in different dictionaries in order to get a wider range of explanations. However, basically, the word empty as an adjective takes two meanings. That of nothingness, nothing at all. Like the empty space in an empty cup, as it were. There the word empty refers to there being nothing at all, but empty space. The second meaning is, the dictionaries are used when looking up various meanings in order to try to make clear what the word empty means here, list a number of synonyms. So empty can also mean insubstantial, vacant, unoccupied, uninhabited, bare, clear, ineffective, and so on. So an example here, in order to explain what insubstantial would mean, a simple example listed in one of the dictionaries I read through would be his promises were empty promises. There, obviously, what is meant is that the promise or promises made were not enacted, were not fulfilled. But that doesn't mean that there was nothing. There were the promises made. So it's a description of something, as it were. Namely, that the promises were never fulfilled. So that meaning of the adjective empty would be more appropriate here in the context of the third seal and what empty means in the context of it. And the definition in terms of these synonyms listed is lacking reality, substance, meaning, or value. So empty in its second, the adjective empty in its second perspective or meaning does not point to nothing at all, or doesn't mean nothing at all. It simply points to a lack of reality or substance.
Penna zigzeta tongba tongchong chil koina tongchong singe koa de kante chil le biorsana ngopu yoba chil tene matongwa chil tene tongba salabro.
So if one looks at nothingness, or the phrase nothing at all, or empty space, how does the mind define something as nothing at all? Well, the intellect does so in order to refer to its opposite, namely something. Something and nothing are two opposites. something means a thing, something. Something is there. There is the presence of something. Where nothing means no thing. There isn't anything at all. There isn't a thing. And the intellect, in terms of its efforts to understand what is said, works in this way. It draws a conclusion with reference to the opposite of what the conclusion is. This may not be very clear or evident, because it's simply about a habit of the intellect which isn't pronounced to the extent where one is aware of that this is how one draws a conclusion. Da dit sier man alla religiører. De tar... Ja.
Det penna tindege koachi yabina. Karichandu bundu sida. Toni gamtap san minduga.
Now, if one arrives at the conclusion that empty, in the context of the third seal, means nothing, nothing at all, then ask yourself the question, if I'm going to meditate on empty in this fashion, how can I do that? Well, it will prove impossible, because how is one to meditate on nothing at all? There isn't even an object of meditation.
Tindege gambe kapke lo de karil gamde gindo tetan. Yepachi gamde giyar. Yepatel to in the mindu some groj gamde giyar. Then the yepa gamde.
The practitioner who draws these conclusions and therefore attempts in his meditation on emptiness to focus on nothing at all, what is it that he focuses upon? Well, he focuses on the opposite of nothing at all, namely a presence of nothing at all, an imagined presence, one would say, on nothing at all. Det du va tongpa se du tongpa tongkyang chik yöde va som det chiki migul chagen nuga go di song so ga
ta 제사 단 대축고 라 십진 차와 망보치 휴고 여래 땅에 뒤석은 당나 되는 산 드린더 산이 예네 휴 다동 쇼사 예싱 게도 셰고.
Now, as to empty or emptiness and what that involves according to the Buddhist doctrine, Khenpo Rinpoche will try to give as many details as possible, particularly in the context of tomorrow's lecture.
나서 다 동바당 당매 생긴데 인투그 조 당면데 공사 게다 생긴데 라지마도 아제 감난주여 버제.
Then we have the short phrase without a self. In the context of the Shravaka path, one of the subdivisions of Theravada Buddhism, that is primarily a reference to the absence of an individual self, a person of sorts.
Till 19 nang goya gi junsen thi pena ta nyin thoi tek par shubbe ta metige korwan the dunge ranjin to zing ne korwala keji some yundo meba dipun me tapchila lamnang yote.
So why is there in the Shravaka path such an emphasis on the individual self in order to understand that in fact it does not exist? The temperament, as it were, or the personality, as it were, of Buddhist practitioners who choose the Shravaka path as their path to enlightenment, their main incentive for practicing the path is their very keen and comprehensive understanding of that any worldly existence is of the nature of suffering, and that the root of suffering in all its forms is that of the belief that there is a person, an individual self. These practitioners see overcoming that belief as what can secure their enlightenment. Therefore, there is a great focus in the Shravaka path on eradicating the belief in an individual self, that the individual self truly exists.
Teaching on the Korwen Nendla Deduk Noa number na Sopandi Ju Nyamontang Lere the impact on Gogyo.
Now, in order to understand what we talked about, one needs to know that in worldly existences, whatever manifests, whatever is experienced in the context or contexts of both pain and pleasure, originate with so-called afflictive obscuring states and their actions.
Tapena nyamung pe number topate rauchin tene gewatan dikpe lechil shungdwa.
De nyamung pe nam tote rauchin se du kanji ko.
Nyamung ke nam tote rauchin thangbo dashak topa thamu chkor. Tene dashak topa te rar sonne tene lungak shawal shugdwa.
Tene kangi chava?
Lüdang mag shawal.
Now,
Tene lechik sangdwa.
In terms of an afflictive obscuring state and an action in its context, as it were, or because of it, consider, for example, desire. Now, one has to know that a mindset afflicted by, for example, desire, doesn't happen in an instant, as it were. There is in the mind a process ranging from subtle to coarse that happens. So when desire surfaces, it's not very pronounced. It may to begin with surface in the context of something one would like to possess. And at first, there is just an inkling of it, as it were, and then that, because of the nature of afflictive obscuring states, that usually escalates until the desire in question is quite manifest. It has escalated. It has developed quite some force. And at that point, the individual will enact that state of mind, either by way of speech or by way of a physical deed, so that it becomes evident even to others that this person really wants this thing or this person, whatever is at hand.
Tendegin yum but namto te ke shawache tubiete ta nga sambe dadu tawa telden yung gogdoa.
Now, without the belief in oneself as a real person, desire wouldn't gain this force. It wouldn't even arise. So the root of desire and other afflictive obscuring states is the belief that one exists as a real person, or that one simply is a real person.
Tene dadu tadu contest tag do ngaranso koran ebe semjin jig tuetang nga de jigi samgdoa jene tanda phado ngai jigbare samgyoro.
So in terms of the individual or the individual self, however one wants to phrase it, there is the belief that there is this person, myself, from the moment one is born till the end of one's life. And the belief is that the person, the individual self, remains the same throughout.
Tan intertek begin do de chen nang to da de chik pa yin chen be ge zendang de hik be che to pong bo song re.
Now, for the sake of overcoming this belief, the belief that there is a person who remains the same throughout the life of that person. Buddha Shakyamuni explained that in fact there is no such thing. An individual or a self of sorts which remains the same throughout the lifetime of a sentient being. what there is, the Buddha explained, is a number of things. And to begin with, he listed what are called the 5 psychophysical constituents, in Sanskrit, the skandhas.
Tene penatang ngaranzo chundela takje tang nga sinkinge ji yue samde ji yin samde te pongpo nge nang takje tang nang da ten shigro pongpo yang dumandu bedang ni.
Now, he did so, as was said, for the sake of making clear that the self does not exist, the person, as a single entity of sorts, remaining the same throughout a lifetime, does not exist. By pointing to the 5 skandhas, the 5 psychophysical constituents, and with respect to each of them, the practitioner is set to investigating each of the 5 psychophysical constituents in order to see if the self is located, as it were, within any of them. Now, in the course of this kind of investigation and analysis, the practitioner would come to understand that even the 5 psychophysical constituents are not single entities of sorts. Each of them is made up of many parts. So, in that, a single thing, the self, cannot be found. One can draw the conclusion that there isn't a self, because if the self, if the person truly existed, one would be able to find it. We're not talking about finding nothing at all here. We're talking about finding a thing, the self, the individual. So if that self, if that individual exists, he or she should be findable, as it were.
Perna tang nga chik dun zembe zentang de zu chi pongbu gele chik chenken peda zu chi pongbu senken de tuman du de bechre ma to chik din chan yo ma re ten da de zu jeri ki ten de yo sanane tene damung bu cha ruk do tang ngam mang tha chön lo sare.
Now, so if we look at the first of the 5 skandhas, which is a category that includes all things made up of matter, the physical body and all other things made up of matter. Now, if we look at, for example, the physical body, in terms of an attempt to locate the person, perhaps dwelling within it, finding, in this way, finding the self, the person, the individual, however one wants to phrase it. Well, it should be clear quite soon or quickly that the body is simply made up of a number of parts. So not even the body or the body itself isn't the body, as it were, in that the label body is simply attached to, by the intellect, a number of parts. So a single body is not at hand. And in the quest for finding the self, one would then have to ask oneself, well, where or in which of all these parts does the self possibly dwell? If one draws the conclusion that the self would sort of dwell throughout, well, that's illogical, because within each of the parts there would have to be a self then. And then you would end up with so many, which this much one quite easily understand is not the case. That would be the logical conclusion.
Tendency to down the penna nga Khenpo Samgyarwa, Chödrak temple Samgyarwa. Ten drive ke nga de ta phungbu zoji phungbu nan sik che yang de ne zok sing ke ten pe yawa mangbo chere ta Chödrak temple mangbo yo sanaya mandik tan yegi mendu sanaya mandik chag do da chi kasi yebin ye gojro.
Now Khenpo Rinpoche explains that he is known as Khenpo Chodrak Temple. Now, if he were to attempt to find Khenpo Chodrak Temple as, or in the shape and form of, figuratively speaking, the individual self, in the context of his physical body, the self dwelling within it, well, then what was just described would happen in terms of his investigation, or would be the result of his investigation. As the physical body is a collection of so many parts, there would then be that many selves. Because if the individual self exists, one should be able to find it. That would be the case. So, if one fails to find the individual self, it can only mean that it does not exist, that it isn't real, that it's simply a figment of imagination. Then one applies the same kind of analysis to the other four of the five psychophysical constituents, and all of them are about mental states, so the immaterial, as it were. If one takes that in the context of one of the four, for example, that of sensation. The same would apply. Any sentient being experiences a variety of sensations. So to begin with, there are many sensations, and each sensation is made up of a process as it surfaces in the mind. So not even the sensation is a single thing. So one would again arrive at the same conclusion.
Penna sorwa dewa sangete ngayina tanga dungete khalaya. Dewa ta dungani galbarwa.
Meta di koma sanchi sungindu tanda.
Penna sorwa dewa sangete nangla ngayuwa yina dungal sangete nala ngachandi yong misherwa. Konin galbarwa.
Reda tene sorva yang dendrup tu tene.
Ja.
Da det soma som dendrup det da gjorva mig på ingo innoga.
Det är inte angro.
Rein det koge marva det hamagona. Det sikten så ser du chigjöna ni den det chigjögo re maskina koge marva. So in terms of the individual self existing, being real, what would that mean? Well, that which truly exists isn't subject to change. Simply because that which changes doesn't remain the same and is therefore not real. So one also has to think about how one understands the word real or truly exists. By definition, that which is real remains the same, isn't subject to change. So when one looks at the notion of oneself as a real person, when one looks at the so-called individual self, then, as was said at the beginning, the self is seen as a single thing that remains the same throughout the lifetime, i.e. it is not subject to change. Thus, if we take the example of a sensation of pleasure, if the self truly exists and is located in the context of a sensation of pleasure, it means that the person in question would experience nothing else, ever. Why? Because that which is real does not change. Meaning, once the real person experiences a pleasurable sensation, that would never change. If that changes, one can draw the conclusion that the self isn't as real as one thought previously. One can perhaps even arrive at an understanding of that the self doesn't exist, because it experiences a variety of sensations. So in its experiencing, or in the realm of it experiencing, there is many changes. And thus this conclusion can be drawn, namely that the so-called self doesn't truly exist because it doesn't remain the same. It should experience the same thing constantly if it were real. But fact remains, there is no such person or self who constantly experiences the same sensation, for example. Hence, a self cannot be located within the skandha of sensation, just by virtue of that there is a variety of sensations. And so, with respect to the remaining 3 of the 5 psychophysical constituents, one does the same kind of analysis. One would presumably reach the same conclusion.
Yang ta khache de some sigre somate ben nga leyes nge zula ta se ta gan I think nge da the se ta nga shepa pon rawch da thunki te bar shepa podang ta war shepa pola so
nge sugla zu mo zung ne ding arang yin se na tenga chepa pucha ge
mare te se ge mare
chi sungin do na
per na mi she ge shub zung do
o ja
den nge zut la ta gi ye nge dra de ning ge ye so ji ga ra su yong ge do
ja den
Ti nan takche tang da yang nye shepa po ngas nge ji nyeg ma re song re. Tela ten kam chob ye ge nam ya sing ge song re.
Now, some people may take the view that the person is the actor, as it were, is an individual who acts in an attempt to define the individual, the person. Someone may say, well, I'm the person who sees this and that. I'm a person who sees my spectacle case. I'm a person who hears sounds, and so on and so forth. So the notion of the person, the individual self, is seen in the light of the actions of the individual, on the basis of the presumption that this justifies the idea that there is a real person, because what we see as the person is someone who acts in various ways, and it's in that context one has to find the individual. Some may take this view.
Ta ti te da pena yulzu Mig Wangpo, Tene, Dinin Samyong to Tilla Logic Jagiore. Consum some go dot. Tin Nane, Dunkin shape of data Kavandu Sida. They are 10 years.
Now, in order to make clear that this is a mistaken presumption, the Buddha set forth a category of things called the 18 dhatus. Now, consider the act of seeing a visual object. Here again, the Buddha pointed out, you have a number of things at work. There is the visual object, there is the physical sense faculty of the eye, and there is a specific function of the mind which registers the presence of the visual object, and then the intellect attributes a label, uses the name everyone has agreed upon as to what that specific visual object is called. So again, there is a variety of, or a number of, conditions or circumstances or parts, however one wants to phrase it, that work together and make the act of a visual perception possible. So in fact, there isn't some sort of person behind the scenes who directs all of this so that visual perception is possible. Visual perception is made possible by the various circumstances listed working together. So a single self being a real person and acting the act of seeing a visual object is not at hand. There is simply a number of factors, the synchronous meeting of them, which make the visual perception possible.
What that interest Jayong to Dorna Tatangi Namdam Mindam Nentende Yong de Giore, then go shake Tundula, then a cabin ne took said of the Sombre, come Genchi said.
So, Dendrigi dates and took.
Descent took. Chu.
Buddha Shakyamuni set forth a number of categories involving various factors, by way of which he explained visual perception and other things. There is a list of 6 and yet another list of 10 such categories, by way of which the workings of visual perception and the workings of other things are explained in the context of pointing to that there isn't some single self and acting visual perception or anything else. What there is simply a number of factors which make, for example, visual perception possible.
That is Jenny. Then consac sinking da consac dado tawa te Rigben one say that mapper the mason touch.
So, in this way, the practitioner investigates the different perspectives of his or her world in terms of finding out whether there is or there isn't an individual self. And this sort of practice is done till it becomes clear to begin with, in the context of logic and reasoning, that there isn't a self of sorts anywhere, as the single self, which remains the same throughout a lifetime, cannot be found. It doesn't exist. It's simply a figment of imagination, and this can be clearly known by way of applying one's intellect in the type of practice just described in brief.
Tene, tan yin tue che lam la lam kin tege, nge pa tinte chen rong tsar du, tene zun ju chakpo chi ki ge ne, tene gongsa rang yin mebe tuen la, lo kam ju go yor.
Now, once a definitive knowledge of that the self doesn't exist has been achieved in this way, what does the Shravaka practitioner do next? Well, he focuses with great attention and with persistent efforts on what he now clearly knows, that there is no self, in order for that to become a realization of, or a direct knowledge of, the fact that there is no self. So he cultivates the now definitive and clear knowledge he has, till that's how he sees things, till he realizes that the self does not exist at all.
Pennan yin tue che lam la shubu kongsa tenzo, sho chik te, korwe dunga la sam ne, kowar ke chik sam yang tendo me patang, kowe tsawar chulwe, dal te, me par ta che na gam yung te, nam yin sin te me chen gam tu buyo pata.
Now, this kind of practitioner who has a very keen perception of that worldly existences are but suffering, and who has also acquired this definitive and clear knowledge of that the individual self doesn't exist, that person is able to, with persistent efforts, apply himself to a path of cultivating that knowledge till he directly sees or knows that the self does not exist. And his knowledge is definitive to the extent that there isn't a shadow of a doubt, there are no hesitations as to that there isn't a real person, an individual self of sorts, and the knowledge is definitive to the extent that therefore this person doesn't want to remain in a worldly existence for yet another second even. So efforts made here are efforts of great force and determination, efforts with the aim to directly know that there isn't a self, an individual self. Now, this kind of practitioner will work on attaining that realization day and night. There is no stopping a person who has achieved this level of a clear and definitive knowledge of that the self doesn't exist. Now, there may be a lot of people who think, well, is that humanly possible to apply oneself in this extremely consistent manner? Can the body withstand this kind of effort? Well, if the focus is one-pointed, then that mindset makes for it being possible to do so. But it takes a one-pointed focus, one without interruptions. Now, in the Shravaka path, when for the first time the absence of a self or the unreality or insubstantiality of the so-called individual self is known or seen, that's the attaining of the path of seeing in this tradition. That's when for the first time, or this is the level where for the first time the practitioner directly sees that the self doesn't exist at all.
Tene ta yunyu gendai top san de gel yugu yaribsana mare ta dong kamsam ge 감슴도 제완전배 영몽 차상봉매바 인자 못튀네 정비
감성기 가래 제바스
감슴도 제완린시 영몽된저 당미 통말에 마도 영몽된저 다동 내요래 박차도 대칸가 봉고요.
So the path of seeing, or the individual who attains the path of seeing here, is called a stream enterer, because according to the Shravaka path, this realization is made up of 16 phases or instances of seeing the fact that the individual self does not exist. Now, this is not the end of this path. It's not synonymous with the goal of the path, because next there is the path of cultivation, where the practitioner who has seen that the individual self is empty, that act of seeing does not entirely eradicate afflictive obscuring states. That realization eradicates the manifesting of those states, but there are still predispositions, seeds, as it were, of such states that are to be eradicated before the final goal, that of arhathood, enlightenment in Theravada Buddhism, can be attained.
Tene tande tanda sezere tene drajambe kampong singit tobare.
And at the end of the path of cultivation, the practitioner then attains the final goal, that of arhathood, enlightenment in Theravada Buddhism.
Tandela kana separate hepatang mejewa hepate songade.
And the arhat, the person who has attained the state of an arhat, knows that he has now been able to terminate
Seju dokam ginyomu, zukam ginyomu, zukme benyomu tenzo. Tese ne chasang pongsarwa imba.
Now knows that he has terminated, as it were, afflictive obscuring states in any shape or form, afflictive obscuring states that can make for a rebirth in the desire realm, the realm of form, or the realm of no form. All of these states have been terminated. The Nipa?
Nipa te karsumarisana mikyewa shepa sumar. Mikyewa sedu tane sumte kamsumji nela namyang mikyewa lorji.
Thus the Arhat knows that he will not again take a rebirth in any of these three realms. Now, according to Theravada Buddhism, this is the final goal of a Buddhist practitioner. And it's referred to as the domain where afflictive obscuring states, possible rebirth in worldly states and so on, have ceased, known as or named cessation. And the Arhat who has attained this state, where all things worldly, as it were, have ceased, then remains in his realization of the fact that in the realization of what empty and without a self means or is about.
That take what simple lula ninter drajam tenzo kalbachim chu la tengen ze tigere chune par sanje ki tuje kulte tene tesing galam shu gogre somate.
So this is a state of so-called samadhi. One could perhaps in general refer to that kind of state as a meditative state where the individual rests simply in his realization of empty and without a self. Now, according to Mahayana Buddhism, this isn't the final goal of the Buddhist path. The final goal of the Buddhist path is that of Buddha the enlightened state. However, the Arhat remains in the state just described very briefly for a period of 10 great eons, a very, very long period, at the end of which the Buddha will manifest to the Arhat and encourage him to enter the path called the Mahayana, the greater vehicle, in order to attain the final goal, that of Buddha the enlightened state. So the Buddha, as it were, awakens the Arhat, figuratively speaking. The Arhat hasn't been sleeping. He's just been resting in his realization of empty and without a self. And the Buddha awakens him, figuratively speaking, from this state and instructs him to now make the efforts necessary to attain the final goal. There may be people who think, hearing this, well, why do we have Theravada Buddhism and the Shravaka path at all then, if it's not about the final goal? Why didn't Buddha Shakyamuni just then teach the path called the Mahayana, the greater vehicle, and then everyone can just do that from the beginning?
제당 되래 공사길 뭐이 렘바민도 몽보여되 소수 강선바를 때네 상징 송그래 줘대.
Well, it's simply because people have different personalities, people have different ambitions, people have different mindsets. Everyone is very individual in that regard, and it's not everyone who would be interested from the outset by Mahayana Buddhism, and therefore would not practice that path. So in order to accommodate for that, people are different simply. The Buddha set forth a number of various approaches so that there would be something that would trigger the interest of a certain group of people, those of a certain type of personality.
대신 성주 샘생겐데 원래 전에지 고아이나 디람도 흉킹 공사대야 하장 로톱 첨부지 고그래 마도 흉미도 웬라고 자 그래.
Now, if one really gives thought to the path called the Mahayana, the greater vehicle, where the central theme, as it were, is that of the body-mind, if one gives careful thought to what the body-mind involves, it should become clear to one that the kind of person attracted by this path is a person of an exceedingly high level of determination. Without great courage and the like, it's simply not possible to properly practice this path.
당 나랑 좀 망쳐와대 대신 인삼교열에 정접심 그 담바 휴교열에 강가 제기열와 옛날양 거왜 등에도 직시한데 대화진 생기도 시한데 나 텐로지선에 지다 챙긴도야 대화 챙기요 대시한데 나 대화진 제고고요 챙기도와 마또 나 코르반딘 안에 된 셈진 펜타기 틴토금도 하변나.
Think of the following. As was said in the Mahayana, the main feature is that of the body-mind. And presumably most of the viewers in terms of this lecture are individuals who practice Mahayana Buddhism. Most of you have also probably taken the so-called bodhisattva vows, committed to the actions of a so-called bodhisattva, someone who practices for the sole purpose of benefiting others in a very selfless manner. However, a lot of us, when hearing explanations about so-called what is popularly named Pure Lands, such as the land of Devachen, Sukhavati in Sanskrit, there are quite a few people who, when hearing descriptions of this realm, compare that description to what they have right now, seeing that what they have right now is primarily about suffering, and it would be much better for me to focus on, and the thought it would be much better for me surfaces, to focus on efforts by way of which I can secure my rebirth in Devachan. There is probably very few in this context who would think the thought, oh well, there is a lot of suffering here right now, and there are so many sentient beings suffering in awful circumstances, much worse than my circumstances. I want to remain in those circumstances. I want to take rebirth in those circumstances again and again in order to benefit those trapped in those circumstances. That sort of reaction is perhaps quite rare in terms of having heard about Devachan. The majority will probably think that's the place I would want to go to in my next life. So that's all for today.
Chega na je balap truba ye sigbe cholen do wa do war sho